At the height of World War II, America's submarine force was handed what was supposed to be a silver bullet, the most advanced weapon in the entire world. The problem? It was a ghost, a total dud. Now, the story, it isn't just about a broken piece of metal. It's about a broken system, a bureaucracy that just would not listen, and the one admiral who basically said enough is enough and risked his entire career to fix it. So yeah, let's get into it.
Okay, so picture this. It's July 24th, 1943. You are Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Despot, and you are staring through your periscope at a submarine captain's absolute dream target, a massive 19,000-ton Japanese tanker just sitting there, dead in the water, totally helpless. It's a textbook kill. So you fire. Thud. Nothing. You fire again. Still nothing. Again, and again, and again. The scene that unfolds is so insane, so maddening, that he actually wrote those words you see right there in his official patrol report.
11. Let that sink in for a second. 11 torpedoes slammed into that sitting duck of a tanker and failed to explode. 11 perfect shots, every single one a dud. And here's the crazy part. Despot's experience? It wasn't some freak accident. No, it was the boiling point of a crisis that had been crippling the U.S. submarine force for almost 2 straight years. The big question was, why? So to get to the bottom of this, we really have to look at the weapon itself, the Mark 14 torpedo. I mean, on paper, this thing was a masterpiece of technology. It was supposed to be the key to strangling Japan's supply lines and, winning the war in the Pacific. Okay, so get this. Each one of these torpedoes cost $10,000 back in 1931. That's about 180 grand today. A fortune, especially during the Great Depression. And its secret sauce, this high-tech Mark 6 magnetic exploder. The idea was genius, right? It wouldn't just hit the ship, it would detonate underneath it, using the magnetic field to break the ship's spine. But here's the kicker. Because they were so pricey, the Navy only ever did 2 live fire tests before the war started. Just 2. And one of them was a failure. They basically said, good enough, and sent it to war based on lab tests with dummy warheads. What could possibly go wrong? So naturally, when the war kicks off, the reports coming back are just a catastrophe. Right from the get-go, 3 huge, devastating problems keep popping up. Problem 1, the torpedoes ran way too deep, just sailing right under the targets. Problem 2, they'd explode way too early, miles from the enemy ship, probably because that fancy magnetic exploder was too sensitive. And finally, problem 3, just like Despot saw, they'd hit the target with a loud clink and do absolutely nothing. Now, the guys on the front lines, the submarine crews, they knew something was desperately, desperately wrong. But when they sent these urgent reports back to Washington, they slammed into a total brick wall of denial. And that wall had a name, the Bureau of Ordnance, or BuOrd for short. The very same group, by the way, that designed and built the torpedo in the first place. I mean, the disconnect here is just staggering. Look at this. The guys at sea, seasoned commanders, would say, hey, these torpedoes are running too deep. And Washington's response? You're using them wrong. They'd report, the torpedoes are blowing up before they get there. Washington's reply? You need to aim better. They're hitting the ship and not exploding. Well, you must not have maintained them properly. For the Bureau of Ordnance, it was literally unthinkable that their baby, this multi-million-dollar project they'd spent 20 decades on, could possibly be flawed. It was just easier to blame the men who were out there risking their lives every single day. And the result of all this denial? It was absolutely devastating. By mid-1942, the failure rate was a jaw-dropping 80%. Let me say that again. 8 out of every 10 torpedoes fired in combat were failing. American submariners were basically fighting a war with ghost weapons. They were taking all of the incredible risks for almost zero reward. But there was one man who was listening, and that man was Admiral Charles Lockwood. Now, Lockwood was a submariner through and through. A real old salt who had actually commanded the Navy's second-ever submarine. He knew his guys. He knew they weren't incompetent rookies. They were seasoned professionals. He trusted his men, and he decided he was going to find out the truth, one way or another. And what Lockwood did next? Well, it was an act of incredible professional courage. He knew, for a fact, that the Bureau of Ordnance would never, ever sign off on the kind of live-fire tests that were needed to prove the problem. So he just ordered them himself. This was completely unauthorized, totally unprecedented. It was a direct challenge to the top brass in Washington. He was literally putting his men's lives ahead of his own career.
He could have been fired for this.
And his first test? It was so simple, it was brilliant. Down in a bay in Australia, his team just strung up a big fishing net, they set a torpedo to run at a depth of 10 feet and fired it at the net. Did it rip a hole at the 10-foot mark? Nope. It tore through the net way down at 25 feet. They did it again. Same result. The torpedoes were consistently running more than 10 feet deeper than they were set for. The proof was right there, clear as day. Undeniable.
So now, faced with Lockwood's hard data and probably some serious pressure from Admiral King himself, the Bureau of Ordnance finally backed down. 8 long months into the war, they admitted it, the torpedoes ran too deep. Turns out a little pressure sensor was getting confused by the water rushing past it at high speed. So the Navy thought, great, problem solved. But it wasn't, because fixing the depth problem just peeled back the onion to reveal an even worse layer of failure underneath.
Right, so with the torpedoes finally running at the correct depth, they started actually hitting their targets way more often, which is great, except they still weren't exploding. This is what led directly to that nightmare scenario with Lieutenant Commander Daspit and the tanker, and it forced Lockwood to launch a second, even bolder and still totally unauthorized investigation into this dud problem.
Lockwood's team over at Pearl Harbor had to get really creative. First, they just started firing live torpedoes straight into a cliff face, and what they found confirmed their fears. The perfect 90-degree hits were the ones that failed most often. But they couldn't just keep blowing up expensive torpedoes. So they built this rig. They literally used a crane to hoist warheads 90 feet into the air and just dropped them onto a massive steel plate. It was a perfect way to simulate an impact, and it finally showed them the truth. The firing pin mechanism. It was too delicate. On a perfect, solid hit, the force of the impact was so great that it would actually jam the pin before it had a chance to strike the primer and set off the explosion.
And this is maybe the biggest, most tragic irony of the entire story. That perfect 90-degree textbook shot that every single submarine commander was trained to make, it had a 70% chance of being a dud. A glancing, angled shot was actually more likely to work. Can you even wrap your head around that? The Navy had spent years and millions of dollars training its best men to fail. So, once again, Lockwood didn't wait around for permission from Washington. His own engineers, working on the submarine tender USS Holland, they just designed a new firing pin themselves, one that was lighter and wouldn't jam. And here's where the story gets a little poetic. The aluminum they used to make these new parts, it came from the propellers of Japanese planes that were shot down during the attack on Pearl Harbor. They were literally fixing America's broken weapons with pieces of the enemy. So by September of 1943, all the fixes were finally in place, and the U.S. submarine force was, at long last, unleashed. But those 2 years of bureaucratic pride and stubborn denial, they had come at a truly staggering cost. And the change was immediate, and it was dramatic. I mean, just look at these numbers. In 1942, when they were fighting with broken torpedoes, the submarine force sank 134 ships. 2 years later, in 1944, with torpedoes that actually worked, that number shot up to 492. The Mark 14 went from being the shame of the fleet to one of the most devastatingly effective weapons of the entire war. It single-handedly choked off Japan's ability to fight. But that victory, it came at a terrible, terrible price. 22%. That was the casualty rate for the U.S. submarine force, the highest of any branch of the American military in the entire war. Thousands of men went down with their boats, and so many of them died in those first 2 years, fighting an enemy they could see, with weapons that simply didn't work. And you know, the most maddening part of all this is that the entire scandal could have been prevented. You know how much it would have cost to do proper pre-war testing? To just blow up a few dozen torpedoes to make sure they worked? About $500,000. Instead, the price of saving that money was, well, it was immeasurable. 2 years of a longer war, billions of dollars in wasted resources, and the lives of 3,505 American submariners. So what are the big takeaways here? I mean, these lessons are absolutely timeless, and they're still so important today. First, you have to test your stuff under real-world conditions, not just in a perfect lab. Second, you have to listen to the people on the front lines, the ones actually using the equipment. And maybe most important of all, bureaucratic pride, that refusal to admit you're wrong, can be more dangerous than any enemy you'll ever face. Real leadership, the kind Lockwood showed, is about having the guts to stand up and challenge a broken system, even when it's your own.
And this idea really gets to the heart of Admiral Lockwood's legacy. His real heroism wasn't winning some big battle at sea. It was winning the battle against denial and arrogance right inside his own organization. He saw a problem, he refused to ignore it, and he took responsibility for fixing it, no matter what the risk was to himself.
Lockwood himself actually called September 1943 V-Day in submarine warfare, because that was the month his crews finally went to sea with a weapon they could actually trust. After nearly 2 long years of frustration, anger, and terrible loss, they could finally fight the war they were sent out there to fight.
So, in the end, the whole saga of the Mark 14 torpedo leaves us with a really critical question, one that goes way beyond just military hardware, right? It's a question for any organization, any project, any team. When does saving money up front become the single most expensive mistake you can possibly make? Because this story is a brutal reminder that a refusal to invest in getting things right from the start, whether that's through testing or research or just listening to your people, it often ends up costing you far, far more than you could ever imagine.